Welcome to Michael Potts F1, everything Formula 1, but from a photographer's point of view. Round 5, the Chinese Grand Prix from Shanghai. Not only was this our first trip back to China since 2019, but it was the first sprint race of the year, with a brand new format. The 5-year gap between Chinese Grand Prix was obvious in terms of organisation, or should I say disorganisation. Things were a little bit rocky on the Thursday. It was hard to get to the track, it was very hard to find your way around, or to find anyone who knew where anything was. But very quickly the teething problems resolved themselves, and fans were very excited and more engaged than in previous races. It was a sellout crowd, and next year there'll be even more grandstands, so expect a much greater capacity. This was the first sprint race with the revised regulations. Sprint qualifying now takes place on Friday, with the sprint race on Saturday morning. Teams can then make changes to the car before the race qualifying session on Saturday afternoon. This new freedom may have caught out Ferrari and Mercedes, who it appears made their cars worse because they were given more time to change the setup. Both teams were less competitive in the race than they were in the sprint. Qualification now takes place on Saturday afternoon, and I found this to be a little bit of an emotional letdown after the high of photographing a race in the morning, albeit a sprint. So what do you think of the new format? Does this flow better than it did last year? The race is still on Sunday as normal. On Thursday, we saw some drivers trying their hand at basketball. A mini court was set up in the paddock by the CBA, the Chinese Basketball Association. Basketball was a bit of a theme on the weekend, and Chinese legend Zhou Guanyu attended the race on Sunday. He is probably the tallest man I've ever seen. Out of the drivers, Fernando Alonso is a particularly good player. Here are some shots of him shooting and dunking. Fernando had a particularly good weekend, claiming third spot in the sprint and race qualifying. He was in a strong position in the sprint before colliding with Carlos Sainz and getting a puncture. In the race, he managed a credible 7th place, with a storming drive on new medium tyres at the end. I did snap some shots of him arriving with his long-term girlfriend, Melissa Jimenez. You may recognise her as one of the presenters of DAZN's F1 show. While both are always in the paddock, you very rarely see them arriving together. Alonso also got a lot of attention this weekend when Taylor Swift's new album was released. In her song, I'm Gonna Get You Back, one of the lyrics is, "I'm an Aston Martin you steered straight into the ditch, then ran away and hid." This was seen by many as a reference to her rumoured affair with Fernando Alonso. Things on the other side of the Aston Martin garage were not that great, with Lance only managing 14th and 15th in the sprint and the race. But not only did he fail to score, but he also caused one of the most dramatic moments of the Grand Prix, when he drove into the back of Daniel Ricciardo during a safety car phase. It looked like he was watching the oncoming corner rather than the car in front of him. And when all the cars braked for the hairpin, he was caught out. It was a very careless error. But then when Stroll went on the radio saying the idiot just slammed on brakes, this infuriated Ricciardo. Not only was he knocked out of the race, a race where he was doing rather well in, and he was on track for his best result of the season. But then, to be blamed for it, well, that was too much for the mild-mannered Australian. And in the press conference after the race, he said, "So, I'm doing my best not to say what I want to say, but fuck that guy. And I'm being nice still." Lance got a meaningless 10-second penalty, which didn't affect his results, as he was already out of a point-scoring position. But Daniel gets a 3-place grid penalty at the next race for overtaking Nico Hülkenberg under the safety car. Had Lance not knocked him out, he would not have a penalty. But despite the frustrations, it was still a good race for Daniel. After struggling in the first 4 rounds, he now has a new chassis, and it appears to be game on again. Hopefully it wasn't too damaged in the shunt, and we will see an improved Daniel in Miami. Yuki was also taken out during the race, so double DNF for Racing Bulls. Not a good weekend at VCarb. But talking of Nico Hülkenberg, Haas were the only team to bring significant upgrades to this race. They updated their floor as well as changed some of the cooling and bodywork. These upgrades proved to be very successful, as Nico Hülkenberg secured 10th place, and he's now scored points in 3 of the 5 races. At one point, he was overtaking Ferraris. This is a huge turnaround for the team, because if you remember, going into testing, they expected to be last, and not just last, but very last. Now they're comfortably 7th in the championship, and they were bringing upgrades early in the season. And more importantly, from a Haas point of view, these upgrades actually worked, which is not something the team has often done successfully in the past. They are ahead of last year's surprise team Williams, and this wasn't a successful race for the Grove-based team, with both cars failing to score in either race. But I do think they would take that, as neither car crashed. So this weekend must have been a huge relief for the team. On the plus side, Alex did have one of the finest helmets in all of Formula One history. This panda-inspired beauty made a big splash on social media. Also making a big splash was local hero Zhou Guanyu. He became the first Chinese driver to start the Chinese Grand Prix. Before the race weekend, he posted a photograph of him as a young boy in the crowd watching the race, showing how far he had come in 20 years. He had so much support. It was great to see and great to hear. Each time he did something, the crowd in the massive main grandstand erupted. He was so close to scoring points in the sprint race with a 9th place finish, but unfortunately he didn't have the race that he would have wanted, returning a 14th position. And this was on a track where the Sauber actually looked quite good. There was a beautiful moment at the end of the race where he took a spot behind the top 3 finishers on the starting grid, and when he climbed out of his car and waved to the fans, this sent the whole grandstand into raptures. And it had such an emotional impact on Zhou that he sort of collapsed at one point, overwhelmed by the crowd's reaction. It was wonderful to see. During the race, Nikon lent me their 400mm 2.8 Z-mounted lens. This is a stunning lens, and it's definitely one of the best on the market in this range. It retails for about €15,000, which is a lot, but it produces some amazing photographs. I particularly like this portrait of Andreas Stella. It's shot at 2.8, and you can see how crisp it is around his eyes, but then how it softens for the rest of his features. It's also a lovely lens to use on track. I took this shot of Yuki Tsunoda making his way to the grid at the sprint race. The lens has a built-in 1.4 converter, which effectively extends it to a 560mm lens. The colours it produces are quite exquisite. Now, if you remember back to my Australia video, I made a prediction that Ferrari would be strong in both China and Japan, and that just didn't happen. Sainz did pick up a podium in Japan, but Max and the Red Bulls were largely untouchable in both races. Partly this is thanks to upgrades that the Red Bull team brought in Japan, and possibly the cooler conditions helped a bit. But the Chinese Grand Prix didn't play out as everyone was expecting. Firstly, the tyre wear was a bit surprising. Everyone was expecting the front tyres to wear out first, but in fact it was the other way around. And being a rare limited track, this probably benefited the Red Bulls more. Max won both races. He had to work a little bit harder in the sprint, but once he'd passed Hamilton, he absolutely dominated. During the race, he had a few tricky restarts to navigate, but again, never really looked like he was under pressure. Another thing that caught all the teams a bit by surprise was the organisers had decided to paint the track in a coat of protective bitumen. This was done last year, and it was an attempt to protect the track and make it more waterproof. But part of the new surface had worn away, and part of it was very, very slippery. And this inconsistency caught a few drivers out, and you saw quite a few of them spinning during the sprint qualifying in the rain. Lewis Hamilton produced a stellar lap in these difficult conditions to claim second spot in sprint qualifying. He then drove exceptionally well to come home second in the sprint race, dueling with Max Verstappen along the way. We saw a little bit of the old Lewis, full of passion and fire, but then he had a disastrous qualifying and only managed P18. And he had the ignominy of driving his car into his grid box. This is something you can only do if you're on the back row of the grid. Logan Sargent, who had qualified in 20th, started from the pit lane. This left P18 open to access. In my opinion, the driver of the weekend was Lando Norris. Not only was he comfortably ahead of his teammate, but he was mixing it up with cars that should have been a lot faster than him on paper. Pole position in the wet on Friday was a fantastic result. He's probably the most fearless driver in wet, tricky conditions. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to turn that into his first win. He did get pushed wide by Lewis at the start after making a poor getaway off the line, but he then went on to qualify P4 for Sunday's race. And here he had much better luck, being able to pit under Bottas' safety car. This gave him a chance to move up to second place and score his best result of the year. It was a mega result for the young Brit, especially considering McLaren weren't expecting their car to be any good here. Thank you so much for joining me for this look back at the Chinese Grand Prix. I really do hope you've enjoyed it. It was fantastic visiting the country again after 5 years, and it was quite an action-packed race weekend. Please do let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you haven't yet, please do like and subscribe. It really helps me grow the channel. If you'd like to see some more pictures from the race, there's a link in the description below. Next stop is Miami, so until then, goodbye.